Hello my friends, my name is Neville Legall, and today I will be demonstrating to you through the medium of watercolor, painting and color mixing in the Barbadian landscape. I'm here at Mount Misery and I'm looking across the view of farmers in St. Thomas, and I'll be painting part of the plantation building, part of the old windmill, and a lot of the foliage and the landscape around. So journey with me as I go about this adventure, and I hope that you enjoy the experience. Okay, having done the preliminary drawing where I worked out my composition, I'm now ready to work on my watercolor paper. This is a lovely sheet of watercolor paper, and I'm now ready to, again, very lightly, I'm going to pencil in the basic shapes. And once I have the basic shapes in, very loosely, again, I'm not focusing on details at this point. I'm just trying to get an overall assessment of the scene. What I like in this landscape is the sloping planes, these kind of angular lines. They create a lovely sense of rhythm, which I think would help to make the composition very interesting. And I like the play of the shapes. So we have some wide open fields, and this white building in the background acts as a nice contrast to some of the shapes. So again, I'm not particularly too detailed at this stage. As a matter of fact, you keep your preliminary drawing simple. Even though this is the final transfer on watercolor paper, you keep it simple, and any detail is left for the final stages when I apply color. And that's going to be the exciting part, because we're talking about color mixing and so on. So that's where the excitement is going to be coming in. So as you can see, I'm very loosely working some basic shapes. Okay, so I think that I can make some adjustments, and that's where observation is important. I can position this a little more down, slant it slightly, and so these kind of trees and shrubs can come a little more beneath, so I don't necessarily need this line. Right. So you should never be timid to make changes. You can, as you see areas that need to be corrected or that could be adjusted for the benefit of the composition, you should be prepared to work with them. You know, art is about having fun. It's about making decisions as you go along. And so change is often necessary. Never be timid. So this is basically my preliminary sketch for the painting. I think at this stage I'm just about ready to paint. So I am satisfied with the drawing. So let me quickly introduce you to the materials I'll be using. First, I have on my palette a nice array of watercolors. It's all squeezed out: yellows, blues, reds, oranges, and I'll be using these. The greens, I must warn you that greens squeezed out of a tube are hardly the greens that you will see in nature. So it's always important to mix your greens, but you will see that as I go about the painting process. So I'm ready to paint, and I usually like to start with my largest shapes. So I'm going to mix up a color for the sky. The sky is one of the largest shapes I have. So I will get some nice ultramarine blue and keep it nice and wet. And one thing to note about watercolor is that the colors dry a bit lighter than they appear while they're wet. So while this blue looks really deep, it's going to dry lighter. And that's ultramarine blue. I'm going to add a little bit of purple as well. So change it. And in watercolor, the water acts as white paint, in the sense that I'm using transparent watercolor. The more water you apply, the lighter the color appears. So I don't necessarily use white. So I'm ready to use this mixture on the paper. So I have my sky laid in. I'm pretty satisfied so far. It is nice and transparent. There are some tones. You can see a darker tone And there's something called atmospheric perspective where in the distance colors appear lighter. So you see there's a softness towards the distance. And I left the paper white for the area of the clouds. So that's usually the basic approach to watercolor. And the process is simply going from light to dark. So I'm going to, as I work throughout the painting, I'll be gradually getting darker, but I start with basic light tones first, and I build up from there. So from here, I'm going to move into the foreground areas, and I'm going to mix some nice greens and yellows and so on, and approach the foreground. I'm mixing up quite a large portion of yellow here because there's a lot of areas to be covered, and I'm going to tone the paper yellow to start with, and then on top of that, while it is wet and as some areas dry, I'll be making adjustments. But I'm going to lay a basic yellow wash on the paper, and I'm going to wet the paper again so that makes it easier. The paint wouldn't dry with any hard edges. So that will make it so much nicer for the kind of effect that I'm seeking. So working into the foreground, I'm going to just wet the paper again to keep it soft. I like working on a wet surface. I love to see how colors merge together when wet. So now the paper is wet, it's a bit saturated at this stage. And there are various degrees of wetness as well. Sometimes the paper can be a bit damp, sometimes it can be saturated. And they create different effects. So I had pre-mixed a yellowish green color, which I'm going to apply all over the foreground. My thing is to get away from a large sheet of white paper. I like to try to cover areas quickly at the beginning of a painting, knowing that I can always come and make adjustments. So this yellowish wash, it is very pale, so it should not significantly affect anything that goes on top of it. It's very pale, it's going to dry rather fast, and while it is wet, I can add other mixtures into it. Introducing a bit of green into that yellow. So the aim is to try to cover the large areas as quickly as possible as part of the building up process. But all that time you are carefully assessing your tones or values and your shapes. So I can pause a bit, I can allow this to dry because it's quite wet at this stage, so I can allow it to dry to some extent, and then I can continue on. But while that is drying, because when you're working outdoors, it is essential that you're working fast because the light changes constantly. So while that area is drying, I can proceed and work on some other sections. So I want to mix up a nice green for the middle ground, and I'm going to use a bit of this is Hooker's green, and I don't necessarily like the temperature of this green, so I would add another color to it to modify it somewhat. So this is a brighter green here, so I'm going to add a bit of this and a tad bit of yellowish mixture which I already had on my palette, and I'm going to apply it in the middle ground. I'm using a large round brush this time. So this green is more pale. It's not as warm in temperature as the previous mixtures I had for the foreground. And while it is wet, I'm looking at the effect of sunlight in the distance, and I realize that I need to adjust it somewhat. I can, while it is wet, add other colors to it, a bit more yellow. And you'll see there's a nice softness. And it's nice and pale, which I wanted. Didn't want it too dark. I want to make some deeper tones for these distant trees. And I'm going to mix some green, combination of blues. I'm going to add a bit of Prussian blue. Prussian blue, I find, is a nice rich blue, and it mixes well with other colors. So I'm going to add a bit of Prussian blue, and I'm going to mix a bit of orange. I'm trying to escape from the greens that are already on my palette that are freshly squeezed. I don't necessarily want to use the greens from the tube. So a tiny bit of red into this mixture. And I can vary this mixture as I proceed, but I want to get some rich, dark greens. And I'm about to apply to see how the mixture looks. Right, this is darker in value and very loosely applied. Right, so I kind of like what's happening here in the background. There's some softness, but there's a bit more depth now. There's some rich tones here, and I like the way the colors are merging. But at this stage, I am a bit bothered by the white space. There's still a bit more white space than I want. I want to get now some of these